I'm leaving. Those two words cut through the dusty Wyoming air like a blade. Mara Whitlock had watched 23 men walk past her today, some with apologetic glances, most without looking at all. She was 30 years old, widowed, and according to every man on that platform, invisible. But just as her boots hit the dirt road leading away from the bride gathering, a voice stopped her cold. "Don't go." She turned. A tall rancher with storm-gray eyes stood 10 feet away, hat in hand, looking at her like she was the only woman in the territory. "Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels." The sun beat down on the Wyoming plains like a hammer on an anvil, turning the July afternoon into something that felt closer to punishment than weather. Mara Whitlock stood at the edge of the wooden platform, her cotton dress already clinging to her back with sweat, her dark hair pinned severely away from her face. She'd learned years ago not to waste effort on elaborate styling, not for occasions like this. The bride gathering. She hated even thinking those words. Around her, younger women fidgeted and whispered, their faces painted with hope and rouge in equal measure. They adjusted their skirts, practiced their smiles, tilted their heads at angles they'd rehearsed in mirrors back home. Mara had done all of that once, 5 years ago, at a different gathering in a different territory. That time, she'd been chosen. That time, she'd thought herself lucky. Thomas Whitlock had seemed like a good man. Steady work as a freight supervisor, a small house in town, promises of stability. She'd married him within 2 weeks of meeting him, convinced herself that the absence of passion meant the presence of something more valuable. Security. 3 years later, he was dead, kicked by a horse while loading cargo, a freak accident that left her with a mortgaged house she couldn't keep and debts she couldn't pay. The town had been sympathetic for about 6 weeks. After that, she was just another widow taking up space, another burden on a community already stretched thin. So here she was again, 30 years old, starting over, standing on a platform while men she'd never met examined her like livestock. "Ladies, please form a straight line," called out Mrs. Pemberton, the sharp-voiced woman who organized these gatherings throughout the Western Territories. She was a thin, severe person who spoke about matchmaking as though it were a sacred duty rather than a financial transaction. "Gentlemen will be arriving shortly. Remember, smile, but not too broadly. Speak when spoken to, answer questions honestly but briefly, and for heaven's sake, stand up straight." Mara's spine was already rigid, but she straightened further, more out of stubbornness than obedience. She'd paid her $7 registration fee just like everyone else. She had as much right to be here as any of these fresh-faced girls who still believed in fairy tales. The first group of men arrived just after 2 o'clock. They came in wagons and on horseback, farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers, all wearing their best shirts, their hair slicked back with pomade that was already melting in the heat. Some looked nervous. Others looked predatory. A few looked simply desperate, which Mara understood better than she wanted to. Mrs. Pemberton positioned herself at the front of the platform, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Gentlemen, welcome to the 7th Annual Wyoming Bride Gathering. The ladies you see before you have traveled from across the territories, seeking honest partnership with honest men. You may speak with any lady who catches your interest. If mutual interest is established, you may request a private conversation in the designated area behind the church. All arrangements are to be conducted with respect and propriety." What she meant was, look them over, pick one, negotiate terms like you're buying a horse. Mara's jaw clenched. The men began to move among the women, some bold, others hesitant. Mara watched as they gravitated toward the youngest, the prettiest, the ones who giggled at their clumsy jokes and blushed at their attention. She'd seen this before. She knew how it worked. A barrel-chested man with tobacco-stained teeth stopped in front of her. "How old are you?" 30, Mara said evenly. His eyes traveled down to her hands, checking for a ring, finding the telltale pale band where one used to be. "Widowed?" "Yes." "Children?" "No." He grunted and moved on without another word. Mara exhaled slowly through her nose. A younger man, nervous and skinny, approached next. "I'm Daniel Reeves. I have a homestead about 40 miles north of here. It's not much yet, but how old are you?" Mara asked. He blinked. 22. "I'm 30. You should talk to one of the other ladies." She gestured toward a blonde girl down the line who kept glancing hopefully in his direction. Daniel frowned, confused by the rejection, but he moved on. Mrs. Pemberton appeared at Mara's elbow, her face pinched with disapproval. "Mrs. Whitlock, you are not here to give advice to the gentleman. You are here to present yourself favorably." "I'm here because I paid $7, Mara replied quietly. "Same as everyone else." "Yes, well," Mrs. Pemberton's lips pursed. "Perhaps if you smiled more, or wore a brighter color. That gray does nothing for your complexion." "I'll keep that in mind." The older woman huffed and moved away. Mara had worn gray deliberately. She was done pretending to be something she wasn't. If a man wanted a cheerful young bride who would simper and defer, there were 20 other women here who fit that description better. She was tired of performing. The afternoon dragged on like a slow torture. Men came, looked, asked their questions, and left. Some were polite about it, others weren't. One old rancher with a face like sun-dried leather asked if she could still bear children, then walked away shaking his head when she said she didn't know. Another asked if she had any money of her own, then lost interest when she admitted she had almost nothing. By 4 o'clock, the platform had thinned considerably. 10 of the women had already left for private conversations, faces flushed with possibility. 5 more were deep in discussion with interested men. That left Mara and 4 others still standing in the brutal sun, trying to maintain some shred of dignity while being passed over again and again. She recognized the look in the other remaining women's eyes. It was the same look she saw in her own reflection lately, desperation carefully disguised as patience. A tall man in a black coat stopped in front of her. He had cold blue eyes and hands that looked too soft for ranch work. "You're the widow." It wasn't a question. "I am," Mara confirmed. "I'm looking for someone to help with my mother. She's ill, needs constant care. Can you cook?" "Yes." "Clean, do laundry, change bedding for an invalid?" "Yes." "I can offer room and board, no salary, but you'd have security. A roof over your head. That's more than most widows get." Mara looked at him for a long moment. "You're not looking for a wife, you're looking for a nurse." His expression didn't change. "I'm looking for someone practical, someone who understands her situation. You fit that description." "My situation," Mara repeated slowly, feeling something cold and sharp settle in her chest, "does not make me desperate enough to accept unpaid servitude disguised as marriage." His face darkened. "You think you're in a position to be particular?" "I think I'm in a position to tell you no. So no." He stared at her for another few seconds, then turned on his heel and walked away, his back stiff with indignation. Mara's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her skirt, willing them to stop. She'd just rejected what might have been her only offer. She'd just chosen pride over survival, and the practical part of her brain was screaming that she'd made a terrible mistake. But she couldn't do it. She couldn't accept being reduced to nothing more than a pair of hands to empty bedpans and scrub floors. She'd done that already in her marriage to Thomas. Been the invisible woman who made his life comfortable while her own dreams quietly suffocated. She wouldn't do it again. By 5 o'clock, the sun had started its descent toward the horizon, turning the sky into bands of orange and gold. The crowd had thinned to almost nothing. Most of the men had left with their chosen women or had given up and returned to their homes. The remaining women on the platform looked exhausted and defeated. Mrs. Pemberton approached Mara one final time, her voice slightly softer than before, which somehow made it worse. "Mrs. Whitlock, there's a gentleman over by the church who's still looking. He's 63 and widowed twice, but he has a successful dry goods store in town. He specifically asked about mature women. Shall I introduce you?" Mara looked over at the man in question. He was watching her with rheumy eyes, his mouth working around the tobacco in his cheek. Something inside her just broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, final crack, like ice giving way under too much weight. "No," Mara said. "Thank you, but no." "Mrs. Whitlock, I really think I'm leaving." She stepped down from the platform before Mrs. Pemberton could respond, her legs slightly unsteady after standing for so many hours. She'd left her small travel bag behind the church that morning. She went to retrieve it now, moving through the thinning crowd with her head held high, even though she wanted to run, wanted to hide, wanted to be anywhere but here. The bag was where she'd left it, tucked behind a water barrel. She picked it up, checked that her few belongings were still inside, and started walking toward the road that led out of town. She'd figure out where she was going later. Right now, she just needed to move. The main street was nearly empty in the fading light. A few shop windows glowed with lamplight. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Her boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. She'd gone maybe 100 yards when she heard it. "Don't go." Mara stopped walking, but she didn't turn around. The voice was male, deep, unfamiliar. Probably another man with another insulting offer. She didn't have the energy for it anymore. "I mean it," the voice continued. "Please don't go." There was something in his tone, not pleading exactly, but sincere, that made her turn around despite herself. The man standing 10 feet behind her was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin that spoke of years working outdoors. He wore simple clothes, dark trousers, a worn cotton shirt, scuffed boots, and held a brown hat in his hands. His hair was dark brown, touched with gray at the temples. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, storm gray, direct, and looking at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I don't know you," Mara said carefully. "No. But I've been watching you all day." A chill ran down her spine despite the heat. "That's not the recommendation you think it is." He shook his head quickly. "I didn't mean—" He took a breath, seemed to gather himself. "I'm saying this badly. My name is Gideon Vale. I have a ranch about 20 miles west of here. I came to the gathering this morning, and I've been watching you since I arrived. Not like that. I mean, I've been watching how you carry yourself, how you talk to people, how you handled the men who disrespected you." Mara's grip tightened on her bag. "Why?" "Because I'm looking for something specific, and I think you might be it." Despite herself, despite her exhaustion and humiliation, Mara felt a flicker of curiosity. "And what exactly are you looking for?" Gideon took a few steps closer, though he was careful to maintain a respectful distance. Up close, she could see more details. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners like he'd spent years squinting against the sun. "I'm looking for a partner," he said simply. "Not a decoration. Not a servant. Not someone to smile pretty and stay quiet. I'm looking for someone who understands what hard work looks like. Someone who's been through trouble and came out the other side still standing. Someone with backbone." Mara laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You watched me get rejected by every man here, and you think I have backbone?" "I watched you reject that last man, even though you probably need his offer," Gideon corrected. "I watched you stand in that sun for hours without complaining, while women half your age were fanning themselves and whining about the heat. I watched you tell that nervous kid to talk to someone his own age instead of leading him on, and I watched you tell Mrs. Pemberton to mind her own business about your dress. You heard that?" "I was close enough." Mara studied him for a long moment. He didn't fidget under her gaze, didn't look away, just stood there, steady and patient, waiting for her to make up her mind about him. "Mr. Vale," she said finally, "I appreciate the compliments, but I've had a very long day. If you have an offer to make, please just make it plainly so I can decline plainly and we can both move on." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "All right, plain speaking, I'm 42 years old, I've been widowed for 5 years, I have a 1,000-acre ranch that's barely staying afloat because I lost most of my help last year and haven't been able to replace them. I'm in debt to the bank and being pressured by a neighboring landowner who wants to buy me out cheap. I'm not looking for romance or a pretty face. I'm looking for someone smart and tough who can help me save my land. In return, I can offer a home, partnership, and respect. That's what I have. That's what I'm offering." Mara blinked. She'd expected many things, but not that level of blunt honesty. "You're telling me you're in trouble," she said slowly. "You're in debt and being squeezed out by a neighbor, and you think bringing a wife into that situation is a solution?" "I think bringing the right partner into that situation might make the difference between survival and failure," Gideon replied. "I'm not promising easy. I'm promising real. And you think I'm the right partner based on watching me stand on a platform for a few hours? I think you're the only woman I saw today who looked like she understood the difference between real life and fairy tales." Mara wanted to walk away. Every rational part of her brain said to walk away. This man was a stranger. He was admitting to financial trouble. He was offering her a share in his problems, not his prosperity. But he was also the first man all day, the first man in years who had spoken to her like an equal, who had looked at her and seen strength instead of desperation, who had offered partnership instead of charity or servitude. "Why me?" she asked quietly. There were younger women there, prettier women, women without the baggage of a failed marriage. Gideon's expression softened slightly. "I don't want someone who needs protecting from reality. I need someone who's already survived it. You've been widowed, you've lost your security, you're standing here with everything you own in a bag, and you're still walking with your head up. That's what I need, that's what I'm looking for." Mara's throat felt tight. She swallowed hard, fighting back emotions she couldn't afford to feel right now. "This is crazy," she said. "We don't know each other." "No, but we could. If you're willing to give me a chance to prove I mean what I say." "How?" "Have dinner with me. Talk to me for an hour. Ask me anything you want. If you still want to walk away after that, I'll pay for your stagecoach ticket to wherever you want to go. No strings, no pressure, just conversation." Mara hesitated, every instinct warring inside her. The practical voice said this was foolish, dangerous, a recipe for more disappointment. But another voice, quieter but stronger, whispered that she'd spent 5 years playing it safe, and where had that gotten her? Standing on a platform being rejected by strangers while her savings dwindled to nothing. "1 hour," she said finally. "Dinner and conversation, and then I decide." Gideon's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though he'd been holding tension she hadn't noticed. "That's all I'm asking." He gestured toward the small hotel at the end of the street. "The dining room there is decent. They serve until 8. Mara adjusted her grip on her bag. "I need to clean up first." "I'll wait." She studied his face one more time, looking for deception or hidden motives, but all she saw was patience and something that looked almost like hope. "Give me 30 minutes, she said. "Take your time." Mara turned and walked toward the hotel, acutely aware of his eyes on her back. When she reached the entrance, she glanced over her shoulder. Gideon was still standing where she'd left him, hat in hands, watching her with that steady, serious expression. She went inside before she could change her mind. The hotel room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand with a cracked mirror. Mara set her bag down and immediately went to the basin, splashing water on her face and neck, washing away the dust and sweat of the day. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman who looked older than 30. Tired. Worn. Lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. Dark circles from too many nights lying awake, worrying about money. But there was also something else in her reflection today, something she hadn't seen in a long time. A spark. She changed into her only other dress, a dark blue cotton that was slightly less wrinkled than the gray. She unpinned her hair, brushed it out, and repinned it more carefully. She didn't have rouge or powder, couldn't afford such things, but she pinched her cheeks to bring some color to them and bit her lips to redden them slightly. She was ready in 20 minutes. When she came back downstairs, Gideon was waiting in the hotel lobby, sitting on a worn settee with his hat balanced on his knee. He stood immediately when he saw her, his eyes traveling over her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You look nice," he said simply. "Thank you." He offered his arm. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The dining room was small and plain, with 6 tables covered in checkered cloths. Only 2 other tables were occupied, a family with young children and an elderly couple eating in comfortable silence. Gideon led Mara to a table by the window, where the last of the evening light slanted through the glass. A tired-looking woman in an apron came to take their order. Gideon ordered beef stew and coffee for both of them without asking Mara's preference, then caught her expression and immediately looked apologetic. "I'm sorry. I should have asked what you wanted." "Stew is fine," Mara said, though she appreciated that he'd noticed his presumption. When the woman left, silence fell between them. Gideon seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Mara decided to save him the trouble. "Tell me about your wife," she said. He looked surprised, but not offended. "Her name was Rebecca. We were married for 12 years. She died of pneumonia 5 winters ago." "Did you love her?" "Yes." No hesitation. Not at first. Ours was an arranged match too, but we grew into it. We became partners, friends. By the end, yes, I loved her. Mara nodded slowly. And you want to replace her? No. Gideon's voice was firm. I want to build something new with someone new. I'm not looking for Rebecca again. I'm looking for someone different, someone who fits the life I have now, not the life I had then. And you think I fit? I think you might, if you're willing to try. The woman returned with their coffee, and Mara took a sip, grateful for something to do with her hands. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly what she needed. What about you? Gideon asked. Your husband, Thomas, you said? I didn't say, but yes, Thomas Whitlock. We were married 3 years before he died. Did you love him? Mara considered lying, then decided against it. Gideon had been honest with her. She owed him the same courtesy. No, she said quietly. I liked him well enough. He was kind in his way, but there wasn't passion, there wasn't partnership. He wanted a housekeeper who would warm his bed. I wanted security. We both got what we wanted, I suppose, until he died, and the security died with him. Gideon nodded, as though this confirmed something he'd suspected. So you know what it's like to be in a marriage without real partnership? Yes. And you don't want that again? No, I don't. Neither do I. Their eyes met across the table, and Mara felt something shift between them. Not attraction, exactly, but recognition. They understood each other. They'd both been through the machinery of marriage and come out the other side damaged but wiser. The stew arrived, and they ate in silence for a few minutes. It was decent food, nothing special, but Mara was hungry enough that it tasted good. Tell me about the trouble with your neighbor, she said between bites. Gideon's jaw tightened. His name is Silas Boone. He owns the land east of mine, about 3,000 acres. He wants mine too. Been making offers for the last 2 years, each one lower than the last. When I refused to sell, he started making things difficult. How? Letting his cattle drift onto my land and eat my grass. Damming up a creek that runs through both properties. Spreading rumors in town that I'm failing, that I can't pay my debts. Some of it's true. I am behind on my bank payments. Lost most of my ranch hands last year when I couldn't pay wages on time. Boone's been picking them up, offering better money. So he's trying to starve you out. Yes. And if you can't make your bank payment, then the bank forecloses, and Boone will be first in line to buy the land at auction for a fraction of what it's worth. Mara set down her spoon and looked at him directly. So let me understand this clearly. You're asking me to marry into a failing ranch that might be foreclosed on within months, where I'd be working alongside you against a powerful neighbor who wants to destroy you with no guarantee of success. Is that accurate? Yes? That's insane. Yes. And you think I'd agree to this why exactly? Gideon leaned back in his chair, his expression serious but not defeated. Because I think you're tired of being invisible. I think you're tired of being overlooked and underestimated. I think you're tired of playing it safe and ending up with nothing anyway. And I think, maybe, you want to prove that you're worth more than how those men treated you today. Mara's breath caught. He'd seen right through her, straight to the raw, angry core of her pride. That's a lot of assumptions, she managed. Am I wrong? She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him he'd completely misread her, that she was perfectly content to find some safe, quiet position somewhere and live out her days in peaceful anonymity. But she couldn't, because he wasn't wrong. What exactly would you expect from me? She asked instead. If I agreed to this insanity? Help with the ranch. I can't afford to hire hands, so it would be just the two of us for now. Fence repair, livestock care, whatever needs doing. I'd expect you to work hard. In return, I'd work just as hard. We'd be partners in every sense, equal say in decisions, equal share in profits if we make any, equal share in the losses if we fail. And the marriage itself? Gideon's expression became carefully neutral. What do you want it to be? It was a good question, putting the decision in her hands rather than making assumptions. I don't know, Mara admitted. I don't know you well enough to know what I want. That's fair, so we figure it out as we go. We can start with partnership and see where it leads. No pressure, no expectations beyond mutual respect and honest work. It should have sounded too good to be true. It should have raised every warning bell in her head. But instead it sounded like the first genuine offer she'd received in 5 years. "I need to think about this," Mara said. "Of course. I need more than an hour." "Take all the time you need. I'm staying at the boarding house across the street, room 6. If you decide you want to talk more, I'll be there. If you decide you'd rather take that stagecoach ticket, I'll buy it for you tomorrow morning, no questions asked." He stood, pulling out his wallet and leaving enough money on the table to cover both their meals plus a generous tip. Then he looked down at her, his gray eyes serious. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think you're remarkable. I've thought so since I saw you step onto that platform this morning. Whatever you decide, I hope you find what you're looking for." Then he put his hat on, nodded politely, and walked out of the dining room. Mara sat alone at the table for a long time, staring at her half-finished stew, her mind racing. This was crazy. This was absolutely crazy. She should go upstairs, pack her bag, and catch the first stage out of this town tomorrow. She should find some safe position somewhere. Maybe as a housekeeper for a kind family, or a seamstress in a growing town, or a teacher if she could find a school desperate enough to hire someone without formal training. She should choose security, even if it meant smallness. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see was Gideon's face when he'd said, "I think you're worth more than how those men treated you today." And for the first time in 5 years, she wondered if someone might actually be right about her. Mara didn't sleep that night. She lay in the narrow hotel bed, staring at the ceiling while moonlight crept across the floorboards and the sounds of the town settled into silence around her. Her mind wouldn't stop turning, examining Gideon's offer from every angle, looking for the trap she was certain had to be there. No man offered partnership to a strange woman out of pure goodness. There had to be something he wasn't telling her, some hidden expectation, some darker purpose beneath the honest words and steady gray eyes. And yet she kept coming back to the way he'd looked at her, not with pity or condescension or the calculated assessment she'd seen in every other man's eyes today. He'd looked at her like she was a person worth knowing, worth choosing. When had anyone last looked at her that way? By the time dawn light began filtering through the thin curtains, Mara had made her decision. Or rather, her exhausted mind had simply stopped fighting what her gut had known since she'd walked out of that dining room. She was going to say yes. It was insane. It was reckless. It was everything she'd sworn she'd never do again after Thomas died and left her drowning in his debts. But it was also the first thing in 5 years that felt like moving forward instead of just surviving. She rose, washed her face in the basin, and dressed in the blue cotton dress again. Her hands were steady as she pinned up her hair. Whatever happened next, at least she was choosing it. At least she was walking into it with her eyes open. The sun was just clearing the horizon when she crossed the street to the boarding house. The front door was unlocked, and a sleepy-looking clerk pointed her toward the stairs when she asked for room 6. Mara climbed to the second floor, her footsteps quiet on the worn carpet runner. She found the room at the end of the hall and knocked 3 times, firmly. Movement inside. Footsteps. Then the door opened, and Gideon stood there in his shirt sleeves, his hair slightly mussed, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw her. "Mrs. Whitlock." "I have questions," Mara said without preamble. "A lot of them, and I want honest answers to all of them before I make my final decision." Something that might have been relief crossed his face. "Come in." He stepped back and Mara entered the small room. It was spartanly furnished, a bed, a chair, a washstand, but meticulously neat. Gideon's few belongings were packed in a worn leather saddlebag by the door. "I haven't had coffee yet," he said, reaching for his jacket. "There's a place down the street that opens early. We could—" "Here is fine," Mara interrupted. "I don't need coffee. I need answers." Gideon nodded slowly and gestured to the chair. Mara sat, and he leaned against the washstand, arms crossed loosely, waiting. She'd spent most of the night preparing her questions. Now she delivered them methodically, one after another, watching his face for any sign of deception. "How much do you owe the bank?" $1,800, payments due in 3 months. "How much can you raise between now and then?" "If the cattle sale goes well in September, maybe 1,000. That leaves me 800 short." "What happens if you can't pay?" "Foreclosure. The bank takes the land and sells it at auction. Silas Boone will buy it for pennies on the dollar. What's the land worth if you could sell it yourself? In a fair market, maybe 3,000, but there is no fair market when everyone knows you're desperate. Mara nodded, processing this. Your ranch hands. Why did they really leave? Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. I told you, I couldn't pay wages on time. That's not all of it. Men don't abandon a job just because the pay is late. What else happened? He was quiet for a long moment, and Mara thought he might refuse to answer. Then he exhaled slowly. There was an incident. One of Boone's men started a fight with one of mine in town. My man defended himself, but Boone's man ended up with a broken arm. Boone pressed charges. My man went to jail for 30 days, and when he got out, he'd lost his taste for working anywhere near Boone's territory. The others got nervous after that. Figured working for me was asking for trouble. They weren't wrong. So Boone is willing to use violence. He's willing to create situations where violence happens and he comes out looking like the victim. He's smart about it. And you think bringing a wife onto your ranch will help with this problem? How exactly? Gideon met her eyes directly. I don't think it will help with Boone, but I think having a partner will help with everything else. The work is too much for one person. I'm barely keeping up with the necessary repairs, let alone improving anything. I need help, real help. And in return, I can offer you something you don't have right now. A home and a future that's yours to build, not someone else's charity. Mara leaned back in the chair, studying him. You said your wife died 5 years ago. Why did you wait this long to look for someone new? Because I wasn't ready before. The first 2 years I was just trying to survive the grief. The next 2, I was trying to save the ranch on my own. It's only this past year that I've admitted I can't do it alone. So I'm a last resort. No. His voice was firm. You're a choice I'm making now because I'm finally clear-headed enough to know what I need. There's a difference. She wanted to believe him. That was the dangerous part. She wanted to believe every word he was saying. What about living arrangements? She asked, changing direction. You said partnership, but you also said marriage. What does that mean practically? The house has 3 bedrooms. You can have your own room for as long as you want it. What happens beyond that is between us to decide when we're both ready. And if we're never ready? Then we're business partners who happen to be legally married. I can live with that if you can. Mara bit her lip, thinking, I want control over something. If I'm going to tie my future to yours, I need to have some area that's mine to manage. Some part of this partnership where my word is final. Gideon considered this. What did you have in mind? I don't know yet, but I need to know you'll actually treat me as an equal partner, not just say the words and then expect me to defer to you on every decision. Fair enough. What if we do this? You take charge of the house and the kitchen garden, and you have equal say in all ranch decisions. Any major choice, we discuss and agree before we act. If we can't agree, we keep talking until we find a solution we can both live with. No overruling, no pulling rank. Just 2 people trying to build something together. It was more than Mara had expected, more than she'd dared hope for. I'm not easy to live with, she said quietly. I have opinions. I argue when I think I'm right. I don't have a gentle temperament. Good. I don't need gentle. I need strong. I'm not pretty. I don't need pretty. I need capable. I might fail you. I might not be enough to save your ranch. Gideon pushed away from the washstand and crouched down in front of her chair so they were eye to eye. And I might fail you. I might lose everything despite both our best efforts. But at least we'll fail trying something real instead of settling for something safe and empty. Isn't that worth the risk? Mara's throat tightened. When had anyone ever spoken to her like this? When had anyone ever treated her strength as an asset instead of a flaw to be corrected? I want to see the ranch before I agree, she said. I want to see what I'm getting into. Of course, I have to pick up supplies in town this morning, but we could leave by noon. It's a few hours' ride. I can ride. I figured you could. A slight smile touched his mouth. You don't strike me as the delicate type. Despite everything, Mara felt an answering smile tug at her own lips. No, I'm definitely not that. Gideon stood and offered her his hand. She took it, letting him help her to her feet. His grip was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who knew hard work intimately. "Have breakfast with me," he said. "Then we'll get you a horse and head out to the ranch. You can see everything, ask whatever other questions come up, and make your final decision there. If you still want to walk away after that, I'll bring you back to town and buy you that stagecoach ticket. Deal?" Mara looked up at him, at this strange man who had appeared in her life less than 24 hours ago and was offering her something she'd almost stopped believing existed. A genuine choice, freely made, with respect on both sides. "Deal," she said. They had breakfast at the same small restaurant from the night before. The same tired woman served them eggs and bacon and fresh bread with butter. Gideon ate quickly, efficiently, like a man used to treating meals as fuel rather than pleasure. Mara found herself matching his pace, equally practical. Between bites, they talked. Small things at first. Where she'd grown up, how he'd ended up in Wyoming, favorite foods, pet peeves. The conversation had the strange quality of a job interview and a first meeting between friends, both at once. "I don't like dogs," Mara admitted. "I know that's terrible, but they make me nervous." "I have two," Gideon said, "but they're working dogs, not pets. They live in the barn and help with the cattle. You won't have to interact with them much if you don't want to." "I don't mind working dogs. It's the yappers I can't stand. The little ones that bark at everything." "No yappers, just Blue and Bell. They're Australian shepherds, smart as anything and too focused on the herd to bother with much else." Mara relaxed slightly. "That's fine then." "What about you?" Gideon asked. "Anything you need me to know up front? Things you hate? Things you can't live without?" She thought about it. "I need quiet in the mornings. At least an hour after I wake up before anyone tries to have a conversation with me. And I can't stand whistling. Thomas used to whistle constantly, and it drove me half mad." "No whistling," Gideon agreed. "Anything else?" "I read. I need access to books. I'll go crazy without something to read." "I have maybe 30 books at the house. You're welcome to all of them. And there's a lending library in town. Small but decent selection." They finished eating and Gideon settled the bill. Then they walked together to the general store where he needed to pick up supplies. Salt, sugar, coffee, ammunition, various sundries. While he dealt with the shopkeeper, Mara wandered the aisles, looking at fabric bolts and kitchen implements and jars of preserved fruit. A woman's voice behind her made her turn. "Well, well, Mrs. Whitlock, I'm surprised to see you still in town." Mrs. Pemberton stood there with a basket over her arm, her expression coolly triumphant. "I heard you left the gathering yesterday in quite a state. Such a shame when expectations don't meet reality." Mara kept her voice level. "I met reality just fine, Mrs. Pemberton. I just wasn't willing to settle for less than I deserved." "Oh, my dear." The older woman's smile was poisonously sweet. "At your age and in your circumstances, being selective is a luxury you can't afford. Pride is all well and good, but it doesn't keep you fed and housed." Before Mara could respond, Gideon appeared at her elbow, his arms full of packages. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said smoothly, "are you ready? We should get on the road soon if we want to make it to the ranch before dark." Mrs. Pemberton's eyes widened. "Mr. Vale, I didn't realize you two were acquainted." "We're engaged," Gideon said calmly. "We'll be married within the week." The packages in Mrs. Pemberton's basket nearly slid to the floor. "Engaged? But you only just met yesterday." "Sometimes you know," Gideon interrupted, his tone pleasant but final. "When you find the right partner, you know. Isn't that what you always say at your gatherings, Mrs. Pemberton? That the heart recognizes its match?" The older woman's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Mara had to fight to keep from laughing at her expression. "Well," Mrs. Pemberton finally managed, "how sudden. I do hope you've both considered this carefully. Marriage is a serious commitment not to be entered into lightly. We appreciate your concern," Mara said sweetly, "but we're quite certain. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a lot to do today." She took Gideon's arm and they walked out of the store together, leaving Mrs. Pemberton staring after them. Once they were outside, Mara glanced up at Gideon. "Engaged? You just told her we're engaged." "I did. Was that presumptuous?" "Extremely. Do you want me to go back and correct her?" Mara thought about the look on Mrs. Pemberton's face, thought about all the pitying, dismissive looks she'd endured yesterday, thought about the pure satisfaction of proving every one of those people wrong. "No," she said slowly. "Let her think what she wants. We can always call it off if I change my mind after seeing the ranch." True enough. They continued to the livery stable where Gideon had left his horse overnight. He also arranged to rent a second horse for Mara, a bay mare with gentle eyes and a patient temperament. "Her name is Honey," the stable owner said. "She's no speed demon, but she's steady. Won't throw you or spook easy." Mara ran a hand along the mare's neck. "She's perfect." Within an hour, they were ready to leave. Gideon's supplies were packed onto his horse, a tall black gelding he called Smoke. Mara mounted Honey with practiced ease, settling into the saddle and gathering the reins. Gideon looked over at her with approval. "You do know how to ride." "My father had a farm when I was young. I grew up on horseback." "Good. It's useful out here." They rode out of town side by side, following a dirt road that led west into open country. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air, and the vast Wyoming landscape spread out around them. Rolling hills covered in scrub grass, distant mountains purple against the horizon, sky so big and blue it felt like you could fall into it. They rode in comfortable silence for the first hour. Mara found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse beneath her, into the clean smell of sage and dust, into the simple pleasure of movement and open space. "Tell me about your wife," she said eventually. "Rebecca, what was she like?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "She was kind, patient, better at people than I am. She could talk to anyone, make friends anywhere. She loved the ranch, loved the land. She wanted children, but we never managed it. That broke her heart more than anything. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." But his voice carried old grief, the kind that never quite heals. "She would have liked you, I think. She always respected strength. She would have appreciated someone who spoke their mind. Would she want you to marry again?" "Yes. She told me as much near the end, made me promise I wouldn't stay alone forever. Said the ranch needed life in it, needed more than just one stubborn man working himself to death." He glanced at Mara. She was right. They rode on. The road narrowed to a track, then to barely a trail. The land began to change, rising and falling in gentle swells, dotted with cattle grazing in small groups. "Those yours?" Mara asked, pointing. "Some of them. Some are Boone's. The property line runs through here, but he doesn't respect it. Lets his cattle wander wherever they want." "And you let them?" "What choice do I have? I can't guard the whole border, and if I drive them off too aggressively, he uses it as an excuse to claim I'm harassing him." Mara filed this information away, already thinking about solutions, about leverage, about ways to turn the situation to their advantage. After another hour, Gideon pointed ahead. "There, over that rise." They crested the hill, and Mara got her first clear view of the ranch. It sat in a shallow valley, sheltered from the worst winds by the surrounding hills. The house was a simple wood-frame structure, 2 stories, painted white, but faded to gray in places where the paint had weathered away. A barn stood nearby, its roof slightly sagging. Corrals and outbuildings clustered around the main structures. A chicken coop, a smokehouse, a small stable. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't even particularly tidy. But it was solid, real, a place where someone could build a life if they were willing to work for it. "It needs work," Gideon said, his voice carefully neutral. "A lot of work." "Yes," Mara agreed. "It does." They rode down into the valley and dismounted near the house. 2 dogs came bounding out from the barn, circling Gideon with wagging tails and excited whines. He greeted them absently, his attention on Mara's face, trying to read her reaction. She walked slowly around the front of the house, noting the loose board on the porch, the cracked window in the upstairs bedroom, the weeds growing thick around the foundation. But she also noted the good bones of the structure, the quality of the original construction, the way it sat positioned to catch the afternoon sun. "Show me inside," she said. Gideon led her through the front door into a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. A large table dominated the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. A wood stove sat against one wall, a faded sofa against another. Everything was clean but spare, functional rather than comfortable. 3 bedrooms upstairs, Gideon said. Mine is the one on the left. The other 2 are yours to choose from. There's a root cellar under the kitchen and a well out back with good water. Mara walked through the space, opening cupboards, checking the stove, running her hand along the tabletop. She climbed the narrow stairs to inspect the bedrooms, each one small but adequate, furnished with a simple bed and dresser. When she came back downstairs, Gideon was waiting with visible tension in his shoulders. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think it's exactly what you said it was. A lot of work, a lot of potential, a gamble." "And?" Mara walked to the window and looked out at the valley, at the barn and the grazing cattle and the vast sky overhead. She thought about the hotel room where she'd spent last night, about the dwindling coins in her purse, about the look on Mrs. Pemberton's face when Gideon had called her his fiancée. She thought about standing on that platform yesterday, invisible and dismissed and furious at the unfairness of it all. And then she thought about Gideon's eyes when he'd said, "I think you're remarkable." She turned back to face him. "Show me the real problem, the fence line where Boone's cattle keep getting through." Gideon blinked, surprised. "You want to see that now?" "If I'm going to decide whether to tie my future to yours, I need to see the worst of it, not just the house. Show me what we're really up against." A slow smile spread across Gideon's face. "All right, come on." They left the horses at the barn and walked east across the property, the dogs trotting along behind them. The land rose gradually toward a ridge line that marked the boundary between Gideon's ranch and Boone's territory. When they reached the fence, Mara understood immediately why this was the crisis point. The fence was a disaster. Posts leaned at drunken angles, wires sagged or had broken entirely, whole sections had collapsed into useless tangles. It was less a barrier and more a suggestion, and cattle were clearly taking advantage. She could see the tracks and droppings everywhere, evidence of constant trespass. "When did this happen?" she asked. "Gradually, over the past year. I've been patching what I can, but I don't have enough wire or posts to do a proper repair. And every time I fix one section, another section fails. It's like trying to bail out a sinking boat with a teaspoon." Mara walked along the fence line, examining the damage, her mind already calculating. How much would it cost to replace it properly? Materials alone? Maybe $200, plus the labor, which would be just me working alone for weeks. Or both of us working together. Gideon looked at her sharply. "You're saying..." "I'm saying this is solvable. Expensive, yes. Time-consuming, yes. But solvable. You fix the fence, Boone loses his easy access to your grass. That removes one of his pressure points. $200 is money I don't have. Not yet, but your cattle sale is in September. That's 2 months away. What if we fix the most critical sections now with what materials you can afford, just enough to stop the worst of the trespass? Then after the sale, we use part of those proceeds to do the full repair before making the bank payment." Gideon was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're already planning like you're staying." "I'm planning like someone who wants to understand all the angles before making a decision," Mara corrected. But her heart was beating faster because he was right. She was already thinking in terms of we instead of you. They walked back toward the house in silence. When they reached the porch, Gideon stopped and turned to face her. "I need to know," he said quietly. "Are you staying?" Mara looked at him, this serious, steady man who had chosen her when everyone else had passed her by, who had offered her partnership instead of pity, who had enough respect for her intelligence to show her his problems instead of hiding them. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them." "First, I want a legal agreement in writing. If this doesn't work out, if we fail despite our best efforts, I don't want to be left with nothing again. I want it in writing that I get a fair share of whatever assets remain, even if we have to sell." "Done." "What else?" "Second, I need you to teach me everything about running this ranch. Not just the house stuff. Everything. Cattle management, finances, dealing with suppliers. I'm not going to be the wife who only knows how to cook and clean while you make all the real decisions." "I'm counting on you to learn all that." "What else?" "Third, I want us to wait before making anything official. Let me live here for 2 weeks first. Work alongside you. See if we can actually stand each other before we file marriage papers." Gideon considered this, then shook his head. 1 week. I need the marriage to be legal before the month is out for financial reasons. There are certain protections for married landowners that I need in place before Boone makes his next move. But I can give you 1 week to be sure. Is that acceptable? It was less time than Mara wanted, but she understood the practical necessity. 1 week, and we sleep in separate rooms until I say otherwise. Agreed. And I get final say over the kitchen and the garden. Done. And you teach me to shoot. If we're going to have trouble with Boone, I want to know how to defend myself. Gideon's smile was quick and genuine. That might be the best thing you've said all day. Anything else? Mara took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of commitment, the point of no return. No, she said. That's everything. So you're staying? For 1 week, then we'll see. But they both knew the truth. She'd already decided. The week was just formality, just giving herself time to settle in and make sure her instincts were right. Gideon extended his hand. Partners? Mara took it, feeling the calloused warmth of his palm against hers. Partners. They shook on it, and something shifted in the air between them. A commitment made, a future chosen, a gamble accepted by two people who had both learned the hard way that safety was an illusion anyway. I'll ride back to town tomorrow and get your things from the hotel, Gideon said. Tonight, we'll make do with what's here. All right. He showed her through the house again, this time pointing out practical details, where things were stored, how the stove worked, quirks of the water pump. Mara absorbed it all, already mentally organizing, already seeing ways to improve efficiency. As evening fell, they worked together to prepare a simple meal, beans and cornbread, coffee strong enough to strip paint. They ate at the big table, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. After dinner, Gideon went out to check on the cattle, while Mara explored the house more thoroughly. She found Rebecca's presence everywhere, in the embroidered pillowcases, the carefully organized kitchen, the books on the shelf with a woman's handwriting in the margins. But it didn't feel threatening. It felt like a legacy, like shoes Mara was being invited to fill in her own way rather than simply stepping into someone else's footprints. When Gideon returned, he found her sitting on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It's beautiful here, she said without looking at him. Yes, it is. He sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Rebecca used to sit right there every evening, said the sunset made all the hard work worthwhile. Was she right? Most days, some days I was too tired to notice. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds. Cattle lowing in the distance, crickets starting their chorus, the wind moving through the grass. Thank you, Gideon said finally. For what? For giving me a chance. For seeing possibility instead of just problems. For being brave enough to try something uncertain. Mara turned to look at him, his face barely visible in the gathering dark. You're assuming this works out. I'm hoping it does. So am I, she admitted quietly. And sitting there on that porch under those vast Wyoming stars, with a man she barely knew and a future that was nothing but question marks, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in 5 long years. She felt hope. The first morning came too early, announced by roosters and the pale gray light that preceded dawn. Mara woke disoriented in the unfamiliar bed, momentarily forgetting where she was until she saw the whitewashed walls and simple dresser of the spare bedroom Gideon had given her. She lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house. Footsteps downstairs, the clank of the stove door, the smell of coffee beginning to drift up through the floorboards. Gideon was already up. Mara rose and dressed quickly in the same blue cotton dress, suddenly aware of how inadequate her wardrobe was for ranch work. She'd need different clothes, practical things, durable things. That would have to wait until Gideon went back to town for her belongings. When she came downstairs, she found him at the stove, stirring something in a large pot. He glanced over his shoulder at her approach. Morning, coffee's ready. I'm making oatmeal. You cook? The question came out more surprised than she'd intended. I've been alone for 5 years. Had to learn or starve. He poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. It's not fancy, but it's edible. Mara accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. She'd asked for quiet in the mornings, and Gideon seemed to remember, working efficiently without trying to make conversation. She appreciated that more than he probably knew. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, oatmeal sweetened with a little honey, yesterday's bread toasted over the stove. Through the window, Mara could see the sun beginning to crest the eastern hills, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. "What's the plan for today?" she asked when she'd finished her coffee. "I need to check the herd, make sure none wandered too far overnight. After that, I thought I'd show you the rest of the property, give you a sense of what we're working with. And tomorrow? Tomorrow I'll ride to town, get your things, file the preliminary marriage paperwork. That'll start the legal process, even if we're not doing the ceremony yet." Mara nodded. The week she'd negotiated suddenly felt very short. "All right, let me help with the dishes, then we can go." They worked together to clean up the breakfast things, moving around the small kitchen with the awkwardness of strangers learning each other's patterns. Gideon washed, Mara dried, and they stacked the clean dishes in the cupboard without speaking. Outside, the dogs were waiting, tails wagging in anticipation of work. Gideon whistled sharply, and they fell into position at his heels as he and Mara walked toward the nearest pasture. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of weather that made you grateful to be alive. They walked through the tall grass, Gideon pointing out landmarks and boundaries, explaining the layout of his land. "That creek runs year-round, mostly. It's our main water source for the cattle in the southern pasture. Boone tried to dam it last summer, claimed he had water rights. I had to hire a lawyer to straighten it out, which cost me $200 I couldn't spare." "Did you win?" "Technically, the dam came down, but I'm still paying off the lawyer." They walked on, climbing a gentle slope that gave them a better vantage point over the valley. From here, Mara could see the full scope of the ranch, the house and barn looking small in the distance, the scattered groups of cattle, the fence line running along the ridge where it bordered Boone's property. "How many head do you have?" she asked. "About 200. Should be closer to 3, but I lost some to disease last winter and couldn't afford to replace them." "And the sale in September, how many will you sell?" "Probably 70 or 80. Keep the rest for breeding stock." Mara did the mental arithmetic. Even at decent prices, that might not be enough to cover the bank payment and the fence repairs both. They'd be cutting it close. "We need to make sure those cattle are in prime condition when the buyers come," she said. "What's your plan for that?" Gideon looked at her with something like approval. "Make sure they're well fed and healthy. Move them to the best pasture for the last month before the sale. Maybe hire someone to help drive them to the auction yard looking their best." "Can we afford to hire help?" "If we can't, we do it ourselves. It'll be harder, but possible." They spent the next 2 hours walking the property, Gideon explaining the seasonal rhythms of ranch work, the challenges of weather and predators and market prices. Mara absorbed it all, asking questions, making mental notes, beginning to understand the intricate web of decisions and risks that defined this life. When they returned to the house around midday, both were hungry and dusty. Mara put together a simple lunch from what she could find in the pantry: cold meat, cheese, bread, pickled vegetables from jars that had Rebecca's handwriting on the labels. They were halfway through the meal when the dogs started barking. Gideon's head snapped up, his body going tense. "Stay here." He rose and moved to the window, peering out carefully. Mara ignored his instruction and joined him, looking over his shoulder. A rider was approaching the house, a big man on a bigger horse, moving with the confidence of someone who owned everything he surveyed. Even from a distance, Mara could feel the arrogance radiating off him. "Boone," Gideon said quietly, and there was something dangerous in his voice. "What does he want?" "Nothing good." Gideon moved toward the door, but Mara caught his arm. "Wait, let me get a look at him first. I want to know what we're dealing with." They watched as the rider came closer, eventually dismounting near the porch. He was in his 50s, Mara guessed, with a thick build running to fat, and a face that probably smiled often, but never with genuine warmth. He wore expensive clothes, a tailored jacket, good boots, a hat that cost more than most men earned in a month. Silas Boone, the man trying to destroy them. Gideon opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Mara followed, staying slightly behind him but visible. "Boone," Gideon said flatly. "What brings you to my property?" "Now, Vale, is that any way to greet a neighbor?" Boone's voice was jovial, but his eyes were cold as they swept over Gideon and then settled on Mara with unconcealed interest. "I heard some interesting rumors in town this morning. Thought I'd come see for myself." "See what?" whether you'd really gone and gotten yourself a wife. Boone's smile widened. And here she is. My. You work fast, Vale. What was it, 2 days since the bride gathering? 3 days, Gideon said evenly, and my personal life is none of your concern. Everything that happens on neighboring property is my concern. Boone stepped closer to the porch, his gaze fixed on Mara. Ma'am, I'm Silas Boone. I own the land east of here. Welcome to the territory. I do hope Vale has been honest with you about his situation. Mara felt Gideon stiffen beside her, but she stepped forward before he could respond. Mr. Boone, she said coolly, yes, my fiancé has been completely honest with me about everything, including you. Boone's eyebrows rose. Is that so? Then you know you're tying yourself to a sinking ship. Vale here is 3 months from losing everything. The bank's going to foreclose, and I'll be buying this land at auction for a fraction of what it's worth. That's not speculation, ma'am. That's fact. The only fact I see, Mara replied, keeping her voice steady, is that you've gone to considerable trouble to make that outcome more likely. Letting your cattle trespass, filing spurious legal claims, harassing his workers. That speaks to a man who's afraid of fair competition. The jovial mask slipped slightly from Boone's face. Careful, ma'am. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. You're trying to force a sale because you know this land is worth far more than you want to pay for it, which means Mr. Vale has something valuable, and you're desperate to take it from him. Boone's expression hardened. You've got a sharp tongue. That's going to cause you problems out here. Only if I'm talking to people who prefer their women quiet and stupid, Mara shot back. I'm neither. For a long moment, Boone just stared at her, reassessing. Then he turned his attention back to Gideon. You picked yourself a spitfire, Vale. Let's see how much fire she's got left when the bank comes calling. 3 months. That's all you've got. And when the foreclosure happens, I'll be there with cash in hand, ready to take this property off the bank's hands immediately. You might want to consider my standing offer. I'll give you $500 to sign the land over to me now. Save everyone the trouble of foreclosure. At least you'd walk away with something. Get off my land, Gideon said quietly. Think about it, Vale. $500. More than you'll have after the auction fees and the bank takes its cut. I said get off my land. Boone smiled, but there was no humor in it. You're making a mistake. Both of you. His eyes flicked to Mara. Especially you, ma'am. You're hitching your wagon to a man who's already failed. That makes you a fool. Or it makes me someone who sees potential you're too short-sighted to recognize, Mara replied. Now I believe you were asked to leave. Boone's jaw tightened. For a moment, Mara thought he might say something else, might push the confrontation further. But then he turned and walked back to his horse, mounting with practiced ease. 3 months, he called over his shoulder. Then this land is mine. You can't stop it. He rode off, kicking his horse into a trot, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Mara and Gideon stood on the porch in silence until Boone disappeared over the ridge. Then Gideon let out a long, slow breath. You shouldn't have antagonized him. He came here to intimidate us. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Gideon turned to look at her, and there was something intense in his gray eyes. You called me your fiancé. You told Mrs. Pemberton we were engaged. I was maintaining consistency. You didn't have to defend me. Yes, I did. We're partners, remember? Partners stand together. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Surprise, respect, and something else Mara couldn't quite name. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know, but not this. Not someone who'd face down Silas Boone without flinching. I faced down worse than him, Mara said quietly, thinking of the months after Thomas died, the creditors and the pitying looks, and the slow grinding humiliation of losing everything piece by piece. Rich bullies aren't nearly as frightening as poverty. They went back inside, but the encounter with Boone had changed something between them. The theoretical threat had become real, immediate. This wasn't just about failing to make a bank payment anymore. This was about someone actively working to destroy them. Tell me everything, Mara said once they were seated at the table again. Everything about Boone. What he's done. What he's threatened. What he wants. Gideon ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion showing in the lines around his eyes. He wants my land because it controls access to the creek. His property is good grazing land, but water is scarce in dry years. If he owns my land, he controls the water rights for this whole valley. That makes him king of the territory. So it's not personal. It's business. It started as business. It's become personal. He doesn't like being told no. And when I refused his first offer 3 years ago, he made it his mission to break me. What was his first offer? $1,000. Nowhere near fair value, but not insulting either. I probably should have negotiated, but I didn't want to sell at any price. Rebecca had just died. This land was all I had left of her, of the life we'd built together. I told him it wasn't for sale. That's when the trouble started. Mara leaned back in her chair, thinking. All right, so he's systematic about this. He's not just trying to steal your land, he's trying to make it worthless first so he can buy it cheap. That means he has a strategy. We need to figure out what it is and counter it. How? By being smarter than him, by anticipating his moves. She stood and began pacing, her mind racing. The fence line, that's his primary tactic right now. He lets his cattle eat your grass, which means you can't support as many head, which means your sale income goes down. Meanwhile, your grass is being depleted, your land value decreases, and you look increasingly desperate. It's effective. I know all this. Yes, but knowing it and countering it are different things. We fix the fence, not just patch it, but fix it properly. That stops the trespass. Then we document everything. Every time his cattle cross onto our land, we record it. Build a case for damages. That costs money I don't have. It costs time and paper, both of which we have in abundance. If we can prove systematic trespass, we can file a legal complaint. Maybe even counter-sue for the value of the grass his cattle have consumed. Gideon stared at her. You're serious. Completely. He's using the law against you. Hiring lawyers, filing claims. We use it right back, but smarter, more strategically. I can't afford another lawyer. Then we learn to do it ourselves. There are legal books, precedents. We find them, we study them, we build our case carefully. It won't be quick, but it'll be thorough. For the first time since Boone's visit, something like hope flickered across Gideon's face. You really think we can fight him? I think we have to try, because if we don't, he wins by default, and I don't accept that. They spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. Mara asked question after question, building a complete picture of the ranch's finances, Boone's tactics, the legal situation. Gideon answered everything honestly, holding nothing back, and with each answer, Mara's understanding deepened. By evening, she had filled several pages with notes and calculations. The situation was worse than Gideon had initially implied. The debt was higher, the timeline shorter, the pressure more intense. But it wasn't hopeless. There were angles to exploit, weaknesses in Boone's approach, opportunities if they were smart and fast enough. We start with the fence, Mara said as they sat down to dinner. Tomorrow, when you go to town, buy as much wire and as many posts as you can afford. Even if it's only enough to repair 100 yards, we start there. We show Boone we're fighting back. That'll make him angry. Good. Angry people make mistakes, and we'll be watching for them. Gideon looked at her across the table, and there was something in his expression that made Mara's pulse quicken. You're enjoying this. What? The planning, the strategy. You're enjoying it. Mara considered denying it, then decided on honesty. Yes, I am. Thomas never let me be involved in decisions. Said it wasn't a woman's concern. I had opinions about his business, ideas that might have saved us, but he never listened. This is different. You're actually hearing me. I'd be a fool not to. You're smarter than I am. I'm not. You are. At least about this kind of thing. Strategy. Seeing patterns. I'm good at the physical work, fixing things, managing cattle. But this? He gestured at her pages of notes. This is beyond me. I need you for this. It was the most vulnerable thing he'd said to her since they'd met. An admission of limitation, of need. Mara felt something warm unfold in her chest. Then we're well matched, she said quietly, because I need you too. I can plan all day, but I can't fix a fence or manage a herd. We each bring something the other lacks. Partners, Gideon said, echoing their agreement from the day before. Partners. They finished dinner and cleaned up together, the rhythm of their movements becoming slightly less awkward, slightly more coordinated. When the dishes were done, Gideon excused himself to check on the cattle one final time before full darkness fell. Mara stayed inside, lighting lamps against the gathering dusk. She found herself moving through the house with a strange sense of belonging, as though the space was already starting to feel familiar. She touched Rebecca's embroidered pillowcases, ran her fingers along the spines of books on the shelf, stood at the window watching the valley fade into shadow. This could be hers. This life. This land. This future. If she was brave enough to claim it. If she and Gideon could somehow find a way to survive the next 3 months. When Gideon returned, he found her sitting at the table with one of Rebecca's books open in front of her, a volume of poetry with careful annotations in the margins. She loved that one, he said softly. Read it so many times the spine broke. She had good taste. These are beautiful. Mara traced a line with her finger. Did she read to you? Sometimes. In the evenings, when the work was done. She'd read and I'd carve. I used to make small things out of wood, horses mostly. She'd tease me that I was going to fill the house with wooden animals. Do you still carve? No. Haven't since she died. Seemed wrong somehow, without her there to comment on it. Mara closed the book carefully. She sounds like she was a good woman. She was. You would have liked each other, I think. She appreciated directness, hated people who talked around things instead of saying them plainly. Then she definitely would have hated Mrs. Pemberton. Gideon's laugh was surprised and genuine. Without question. They sat together in the lamplight, comfortable in the quiet. Outside, crickets sang and the wind moved through the grass, and the vast Wyoming sky deepened to black. I should tell you, Gideon said eventually, Boone wasn't exaggerating about the timeline. I have exactly 87 days until the bank payment is due. If I can't pay, they foreclose immediately. There's no extension, no negotiation. The contract is very clear. 87 days, Mara repeated. How much do you need total? $1,800 for the bank. Another $200 minimum for fence repairs. Plus operating costs. Feed supplements, basic supplies. Call it $2,200 total. And you can raise maybe $1,000 from the cattle sale. If prices are decent, if the cattle look good, if nothing goes wrong between now and then. Mara drummed her fingers on the table, thinking. What other assets do you have? Anything you could sell if you had to? Not much. The furniture is mostly worthless. I've got tools, but I need those. There's Rebecca's jewelry, a few pieces her mother left her. I've never been able to bring myself to sell them, but if it comes to that, save that as a last resort. What about hiring out? Could you do work for other ranchers and earn cash that way? Maybe, but that takes time away from our own work, and we're already stretched thin. They went around and around, examining every option, every possibility. By the time they finally called it a night and went upstairs to their separate rooms, Mara's head was spinning with numbers and strategies and contingencies. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Gideon moving around in his own room across the hall. The situation was desperate. The odds were stacked against them. Silas Boone had money and power and the law on his side. But they had something too. They had determination, intelligence, the willingness to work harder than anyone thought possible, and they had each other. It wasn't much, but maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The next morning, Gideon left for town before dawn, taking a list of supplies and Mara's instructions about what to prioritize. She spent the day alone on the ranch, familiarizing herself with everything: the chickens, the garden, the barn, the rhythms of the place. She found tools and got to work on small repairs around the house. Fixed the loose porch board, cleared the weeds from around the foundation, started planning a better organization system for the root cellar. The physical work felt good, purposeful. She was building something, claiming this space as her own. Around mid-afternoon, she heard horses approaching and went to investigate. But it wasn't Gideon returning early. It was 3 of Boone's ranch hands sitting their horses just beyond the property line, watching her with expressions that made her skin crawl. Mara straightened, wiping her dirty hands on her skirt, and walked toward them slowly. She stopped a good 20 feet away, close enough to talk but far enough to run if necessary. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she called. The largest of the three, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, smiled without warmth. "Just wanted to get a look at Vale's new woman. See what kind of fool agrees to marry a dying ranch. You've looked. Now you can leave." "Awful lonely out here for a woman by herself," another one said. "Awful dangerous, too. Lots of things can go wrong on a ranch. Accidents happen." The threat was unmistakable. Mara felt fear spike through her, but she forced herself to stay calm, to not show weakness. "My fiancé will be back soon, along with witnesses to anything that might happen here. So unless you want to explain to the sheriff why you were trespassing and making threats, I suggest you move along." "We're not on your property," Scarface pointed out. "We're on the boundary, perfectly legal to sit our horses here and have a conversation." "Then let me be perfectly clear in my response. I'm not intimidated by you, neither is Gideon. Whatever Silas Boone is paying you to harass us, it's not enough. Now leave." They sat there for another long moment, clearly trying to decide if they wanted to push further. Mara held her ground, her heart hammering but her expression steady. Finally, Scarface shrugged. "Just delivering a message, ma'am. Boss wanted you to know that Vale's not the only one who can have accidents. Women get hurt on ranches all the time. Falls, kicks from horses, all sorts of unfortunate incidents." "Message received. Now get out of my sight." They turned their horses and rode away slowly, laughing among themselves. Mara watched until they disappeared, then walked back to the house on legs that trembled slightly. She sat down hard on the porch steps, her breath coming fast. They'd threatened her. Directly. Unmistakably threatened her. Boone was escalating. When Gideon returned that evening, loaded down with supplies and Mara's belongings from the hotel, she told him everything. His face went dark with rage. "I'll kill them," he said flatly. "I'll ride over there right now and—" "No." Mara caught his arm. "That's exactly what Boone wants. He wants you to do something violent, something he can use against you. We have to be smarter than that. They threatened you." "Yes, and we're going to document it, and we're going to be prepared for next time, but we're not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing us panic." Gideon's hands were clenched into fists. "If they touch you, they won't, because I'm not going to be alone anymore, and because tomorrow you're going to teach me to shoot, like I asked. I'm not going to be defenseless." He looked at her for a long moment, clearly fighting the urge to ride straight to Boone's property and start a war. But slowly, gradually, Mara saw him master the rage, channel it into something colder and more controlled. "All right," he said finally. "Tomorrow, first thing, I teach you to shoot. And from now on, you carry a gun whenever you're outside alone." "Agreed." They unpacked the wagon together in tense silence. Mara's few belongings looked pathetic spread out on the spare bed. 2 dresses, some undergarments, a hairbrush, the small bag of coins that represented her entire savings. But Gideon had also bought fabric in town, rough cotton suitable for work dresses. "Thought you might need something more practical," he said gruffly. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store helped me pick it out. She said you'd know what to do with it." Mara touched the fabric, feeling unexpectedly emotional. "Thank you, that was thoughtful. Partners take care of each other." They ate a quiet dinner, both lost in thought. The encounter with Boone's men had shifted something, made the danger feel immediate and personal in a way it hadn't before. After dinner, Gideon brought out the legal papers he'd picked up in town, the preliminary marriage documents that needed to be signed and filed. "We don't have to do this yet," he said. "Your week isn't up." Mara looked at the papers, then at Gideon's serious face. "If we're going to fight Boone, we need every advantage. Legal marriage gives us protections we don't have otherwise. Sign them." "You're sure?" Was she? It had been less than 3 days since they'd met. 3 days since she'd been standing on that platform, invisible and rejected. Now she was signing papers that would legally bind her to this man, this ranch, this uncertain future. But when she looked at Gideon, she didn't see uncertainty. She saw partnership, respect, a man who valued her mind as much as her labor, who listened when she spoke, who trusted her judgment. She'd never had that before, not once in her entire life. "I'm sure," she said. "Where do I sign?" They signed the papers together at the kitchen table, witnessed by the lamplight and the vast silence of the ranch around them. When it was done, they were legally committed. For better or worse, for richer or poorer, in success or failure. Partners in truth now, not just in word. And outside in the darkness, somewhere beyond the ridgeline, Silas Boone was planning his next move. But so were they. The morning sun was barely above the horizon when Gideon led Mara out behind the barn, a rifle in his hands and a grim determination in his eyes. The dogs watched from a distance, sensing the seriousness of the moment, staying quiet and still. "This is a Winchester," Gideon said, holding up the weapon. 15 shots, reliable, accurate enough for what you'll need. I'm going to teach you to load it, clean it, and shoot it. By the time we're done today, you're going to be comfortable with this rifle in your hands." Mara reached out and took the weapon, feeling its weight, its solid reality. It was heavier than she'd expected, the wood stock smooth and worn from years of use. "First rule," Gideon continued, his voice taking on the tone of a patient teacher. "Never point it at anything you don't intend to shoot. Second rule, always assume it's loaded, even when you know it isn't. Third rule, know your target and what's beyond it before you pull the trigger." He spent the next hour teaching her the mechanics, how to load the tubular magazine, how to work the lever action, how to sight down the barrel. Mara absorbed every detail, her hands learning the movements through repetition until they became automatic. Then came the actual shooting. Gideon set up tin cans on fence posts 50 yards away. "Start with those. Don't worry about hitting them yet. Just get used to the feel of the trigger, the recoil, the noise." Mara raised the rifle to her shoulder the way he'd shown her, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was louder than she'd expected, the recoil shoving her shoulder back hard enough to make her stagger. The shot went wide, kicking up dust 10 feet to the left of the target. "Again," Gideon said calmly. "Keep your stance wider, lean into it." She fired again, and again, and again. By the 10th shot, her shoulder ached and her ears were ringing, but she was starting to understand the rhythm of it, the way the rifle wanted to be held, the moment between breath and trigger pull where everything aligned. On the 15th shot, she hit a can. It flew off the post with a satisfying clang. "There," Gideon said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. "You're getting it. Let's reload and go again." They spent 3 hours at it, until Mara's arms trembled from holding the rifle and her shoulder was bruised from the recoil. But by the end, she was hitting more targets than she missed, her shots grouping tighter, her confidence growing. "You're a natural," Gideon said as they walked back to the house, the rifle comfortable now in Mara's grip. "Better than I was when I started. I'm motivated. Fear's an excellent teacher." "It is, but don't let it make you reckless. If Boone's men come back, the goal isn't to shoot them. The goal is to make them think twice about approaching. Show them you're armed and capable. That's usually enough." "And if it's not?" Gideon's expression hardened. "Then you shoot to defend yourself, and we deal with the consequences after. But it won't come to that. Boone's smart enough not to push things that far. He wants to intimidate us into leaving, not create a situation that might involve the law too directly." They reached the house and Gideon showed her where to store the rifle, in a rack by the door, always loaded, always ready. Then they moved on to the day's work. The fence wire and posts Gideon had purchased sat in the wagon, waiting to be deployed. They loaded tools and supplies onto the wagon bed, hitched up the horses, and drove out to the eastern boundary where the damage was worst. Up close, in full daylight, the fence line was even more of a disaster than Mara had initially thought. Posts had rotted at their bases and toppled over. Wire had rusted through in places or been trampled down by repeated cattle crossings. Entire sections had simply disappeared, probably stolen by Boone's men for use on his own property. "We'll start here," Gideon said, pointing to a stretch where the post still stood, but the wire was gone. "Replace the wire first, reinforce the existing post where we can. It's not a permanent fix, but it'll slow the trespass." They worked side by side in the growing heat, Mara learning as they went. Gideon showed her how to dig post holes, how to set posts at the right depth, how to string wire tight enough to be effective, but not so tight it would snap in the wind. The work was brutally hard, each post requiring digging through rocky soil, each wire strand demanding precise tension. Mara's hands blistered within the first hour. By midday they were bleeding despite the work gloves Gideon had given her. But she didn't stop, didn't complain, just kept working, post after post, wire after wire, the sun beating down relentlessly. They took a brief break for lunch. bread and cheese eaten in the shade of the wagon while the horses rested. Mara's whole body ached, muscles screaming from unfamiliar labor. But there was also satisfaction in it, in seeing the tangible progress they were making. "You're tougher than you look," Gideon said, offering her the canteen. "I've had plenty of practice at doing things that hurt." Mara drank deeply, the water barely touching her thirst. "This is just a different kind of pain. We can stop for today. Come back tomorrow." "No, we finished this section. I want to see it done." They worked through the afternoon, the sun crawling across the sky in its slow arc. By late afternoon, they'd replaced nearly 200 yards of fence line. Not much in the grand scope of the problem, but enough to make a visible difference. Where there had been open gaps, there was now a barrier. Not perfect, not permanent, but real. As they were loading the tools back into the wagon, preparing to head home, movement on the ridge caught Mara's attention. 3 riders silhouetted against the sky, watching them. "Gideon?" she said quietly. He followed her gaze and his jaw tightened. "Boone's men. They've been watching us all day." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Didn't want to worry you. They're just observing, making sure we know they're there." Mara stared up at the distant figures, feeling anger rise hot in her chest. "They're trying to intimidate us." "Yes. It's not working." "Good." Gideon climbed onto the wagon seat and offered Mara his hand. She took it and hauled herself up beside him, every muscle protesting. "Let them watch. Let them report back to Boone that we're not running scared. Let him know we're fighting back." They drove home in the golden light of late afternoon, the new fence line behind them, the watchers on the ridge eventually disappearing as distance and terrain blocked the view. When they reached the house, both were exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, their hands raw from the day's labor. "Go wash up," Gideon said. "I'll handle the horses and get dinner started." Mara was too tired to argue. She went inside, pumped water into the basin, and scrubbed her face and hands and arms, watching the water turn brown with accumulated dirt. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman she barely recognized. Sunburned, disheveled, marks of hard work written across every visible inch of skin. But her eyes were bright, alive, engaged with the world in a way they hadn't been in years. By the time she came back downstairs, Gideon had a simple meal laid out: cold roasted chicken left from yesterday, fresh tomatoes from the garden, bread. They ate ravenously, neither speaking, both too hungry and tired for conversation. After dinner, Mara pulled out the fabric Gideon had bought and began cutting out a pattern for a work dress. Her hands were clumsy with exhaustion and pain, but she pushed through, determined to have something more practical to wear tomorrow. Gideon sat across from her, cleaning and oiling the tools they'd used that day, the domestic scene oddly peaceful despite everything happening around them. "I need to go into town again tomorrow," he said eventually. "File the marriage certificate, talk to the bank about the payment schedule. You want to come?" Mara considered it. Part of her wanted to see the town, to establish herself as Gideon's wife, to make their partnership visible and official. But another part of her recognized that the ranch needed constant attention, and leaving it unguarded, even for a few hours, felt dangerous. "No," she said. "I'll stay here. Keep working on the fence, get the garden in better shape, but I want you to do something for me while you're there." "What's that?" "Stop by the lawyer who helped you with the water rights case. Ask him about documentation requirements for filing a harassment complaint. Get the forms we'd need, find out what kind of evidence we need to collect." Gideon looked up from the tools. "You're serious about building a legal case?" "Completely. Boone thinks he can squeeze us out through intimidation. We're going to turn that around on him, make every threat, every trespass, every act of harassment into evidence that can be used against him. That could take months to build. Then we start now, because even if it doesn't pay off in time to stop the foreclosure, it gives us leverage. If Boone knows we're documenting everything, that we're prepared to file complaints, that we're not just rolling over, it changes his calculations, makes him more cautious." Gideon studied her face for a long moment. "You've thought this through." "I've thought about little else since those men showed up yesterday. We can't beat Boone with money. He has more than us. We can't beat him with physical force. He has more men. But we can beat him with persistence and documentation. We can make ourselves expensive to destroy." A slow smile spread across Gideon's face. "You're remarkable, you know that?" Mara felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm practical. You're both. He returned his attention to the tools, but the smile remained. I'll talk to the lawyer, get the forms. We'll start documenting everything. They worked in companionable silence for another hour before exhaustion drove them both upstairs. Mara fell into bed still wearing her clothes, too tired to change, and was asleep within seconds. She woke to darkness and the sound of dogs barking frantically. Mara sat up, disoriented, her heart pounding. Through the window, she could see an orange glow that hadn't been there when she'd gone to sleep. Fire. She ran to the window, and her blood turned to ice. The barn was burning. "Gideon!" She was shouting even as she ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time. "Gideon! The barn!" He burst out of his room, already pulling on his boots, his face grim. "I see it. Get dressed. We need to move the cattle away from the structure before the fire spooks them into stampeding." Mara threw on her clothes with shaking hands, her mind racing. This wasn't an accident. This was arson. This was Boone escalating again, making good on his threats. By the time she got outside, Gideon was already running toward the barn, the dogs at his heels. The fire had engulfed the hayloft and was spreading rapidly down the sides of the structure. The heat was intense, even from 50 yards away. Mara ran after him, fear and fury warring in her chest. The cattle in the nearby pasture were already agitated, milling nervously, their eyes rolling white in the firelight. "Open the gate," Gideon shouted. "Drive them toward the creek pasture, away from the barn." Mara ran to the gate and hauled it open, then grabbed a long stick and began driving the cattle through, waving her arms and shouting. The dogs helped, darting and nipping at heels, their training kicking in despite the chaos. The cattle streamed through the gate, their panic controlled just enough to keep them moving in the right direction. Behind them, the barn groaned and one wall collapsed inward with a crash that sent sparks spiraling into the night sky. Mara's heart clenched. Everything in that barn, tools, tack, winter hay stores, was gone. Months of work, irreplaceable supplies, all burning. The horses! Gideon was running toward the small stable attached to the side of the barn. Smoke was already pouring from the stable door, and Mara could hear the animals screaming inside. She sprinted after him, arriving just as he kicked open the door. Black smoke billowed out, choking and thick. Gideon tied a bandana over his nose and mouth and plunged inside. Mara couldn't see him through the smoke. She heard crashing, the terrified neighing of horses, Gideon's voice trying to soothe them, even as he worked to free them from their stalls. Then Smoke, Gideon's black gelding, came charging out, eyes wild, nearly trampling Mara in his panic. She jumped aside and the horse thundered past, heading for open ground. A moment later, Honey emerged, Gideon leading her by her halter, his other arm shielding his face from the heat. He got her clear of the building and released her, sending her running after Smoke. "That's all of them," he gasped, coughing violently. "The rest were in the barn proper. They're gone." Mara grabbed his arm and pulled him further from the building as another section of roof collapsed. "There's nothing more we can do. We have to let it burn." They stood together in the yard, watching the barn consumed by flames, the fire bright enough to turn night into day. The heat was tremendous, driving them back further and further until they were nearly at the house. "Boone did this," Mara said, her voice shaking with rage. "His men did this. Yes. We could have been killed if the fire had spread to the house, but it didn't." Gideon's face was set in hard lines, his jaw clenched. They timed it carefully. Set it when the wind was blowing away from the house, when there was less risk of the fire spreading beyond the barn. They wanted to hurt us, not murder us. How generous. They watched in bitter silence as the barn burned to its foundation, taking with it tools, hay, equipment they couldn't afford to replace. By the time the sun rose, there was nothing left but smoking rubble and ash. Gideon walked through the ruins once they'd cooled enough, salvaging what little he could. A few metal tools that had survived the heat. Some chain that could be cleaned and reused. But everything else was gone. Mara found him standing in what had been the center of the barn, looking at the destruction with hollow eyes. "How much?" she asked quietly. "In losses? Maybe $800 worth of equipment and hay, plus 2 horses that were stabled in the barn, not valuable animals, but still a loss." He picked up a twisted piece of metal that had once been a bridle. "That puts us even further behind." Mara felt tears of frustration and rage burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. We document this. We ride to town right now. We report it to the sheriff. We make an official complaint. The sheriff won't do anything. He's in Boone's pocket. Not completely, but enough that he won't investigate without clear proof. Then we get proof. We find evidence of arson. We find witnesses. We build a case so strong he can't ignore it. Gideon looked at her, and she saw defeat starting to creep into his expression. Mara, maybe you should go. Take what money we have and catch a stage somewhere safe. You didn't sign up for this. You didn't know it would get this dangerous. No. Her voice was hard as iron. Absolutely not. I'm not running. I'm not giving Boone the satisfaction. He could have killed you last night. But he didn't. And now I'm angry enough to fight 10 times harder. She grabbed Gideon's arm, forcing him to look at her. This is what he wants. For us to give up, to walk away. That's his entire strategy. He pushes and pushes until we break. Well, I'm not breaking. Are you? Gideon stared at her for a long moment, and she watched as something shifted in his eyes. The defeat faded, replaced by a fierce determination that matched her own. No, he said. I'm not breaking. Then we fight back. We fight smarter and harder and more relentlessly than he expects. We make him regret ever starting this war. They rode to town an hour later, both of them soot-stained and exhausted but burning with purpose. Mara insisted on coming this time, refused to be left alone at the ranch. They filed a report with the skeptical sheriff, who took notes with obvious reluctance but couldn't refuse to document the complaint. Then they went to the lawyer's office. Harold Peterson was a thin, elderly man with sharp eyes and a reputation for honesty that made him unpopular with the wealthier ranchers. He listened to their story without interruption, his expression growing grimmer as Gideon described the escalating harassment. Boone's playing a dangerous game, Peterson said when they'd finished. Arson is a serious crime, but proving he ordered it will be nearly impossible without witnesses willing to testify. What about the pattern of harassment? Mara asked. Multiple incidents over time, all benefiting Boone, all targeting Gideon. Doesn't that establish something? It establishes suspicion, not proof. But Peterson tapped his pen against his desk thoughtfully. If you're willing to be strategic about this, there might be an angle. Boone's been very careful not to leave direct evidence, but his men have been less careful. If we could get one of them to talk, to testify against Boone in exchange for leniency. How would we do that? Gideon interrupted. You make life uncomfortable for them. You document every trespass by Boone's cattle, file damage claims. You force the sheriff to investigate even when he doesn't want to. You make enough noise that Boone's men start to worry they're going to be the ones who take the fall if this goes to trial. Mara leaned forward. You think we can actually turn one of them? I think ranch hands are loyal until they're looking at jail time. Then loyalty becomes negotiable. Peterson pulled out a stack of forms. Here, these are the documentation templates you'll need. Date, time, description of incident, physical evidence if any. Fill these out for every incident, past and future. Build a file. Make it comprehensive enough that when the time comes to present it, it tells a story no reasonable person can ignore. They left Peterson's office with a plan and a stack of legal forms. Stopped at the general store to replace the most critical tools they'd lost in the fire. Spending money they couldn't spare but had no choice about. Picked up supplies. Exchanged tense words with other townspeople who'd clearly heard about the barn fire and had their own opinions about who was to blame. By the time they headed back to the ranch, the sun was high and brutal. They rode in silence, both processing the magnitude of what they were up against. When they crested the ridge and looked down into the valley, the blackened scar of the barn was visible even from a distance, a stark reminder of how much they stood to lose. But as they rode closer, Mara noticed something else. The fence section they'd repaired yesterday was still standing. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the pasture. The house was untouched, and despite everything, the ranch was still theirs, still worth fighting for. They spent the rest of the day salvaging what they could from the barn ruins and beginning the process of reorganizing the ranch without it. The tools that survived the fire were cleaned and stored in the house. The horses were temporarily corralled in a makeshift pen Gideon constructed from salvaged fence posts. The cattle were moved to different pastures to keep them away from the dangerous debris. It was nearly dark when they finally stopped working. Both were filthy, exhausted to the bone, their hands torn and blistered from the day's labor. They stood together by the remains of the barn, looking at the destruction in the fading light. "We're going to rebuild," Mara said quietly. "When this is over, when we've saved the ranch and dealt with Boone, we're going to rebuild this barn better than it was." Gideon looked at her, and there was something soft in his expression. "You talk like you're certain we're going to win." "I am certain, because losing is not an option I'm willing to accept." She turned to face him fully. "Boone thinks he broke us last night. He thinks the barn fire was the final straw. Tomorrow, when his men ride by to survey the damage and see us defeated, they're going to find us working, fixing fence, moving cattle, continuing exactly as we were before. We're going to show him that we can't be broken." Gideon reached out and took her hand, his grip warm despite the coolness of the evening air. "How did I get so lucky?" "Lucky? Your barn just burned down. Lucky that you were standing on that platform 4 days ago. Lucky that you took a chance on me. Lucky that I have a partner who's too stubborn to quit, even when quitting makes sense." Mara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "We're both stubborn. That's why this is going to work." They stood there as darkness fell around them, hand in hand, facing the ruins of what they'd lost and the immense challenges still ahead. Tomorrow would bring more work, more danger, more reasons to doubt whether they could survive what was coming. But tonight, they had each other. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like enough. When they finally went inside, Mara took the first legal form from Peterson's stack and began filling it out in careful detail. Date of incident: last night. Description: arson, total loss of barn and contents, estimated damages, $800 plus 2 horses. Evidence: pattern of escalating harassment by Silas Boone and his employees. It was just one form, one piece of documentation in what would need to be an overwhelming case. But it was a start. And every journey, Mara thought as she wrote, begins with a single step forward into the unknown. The days that followed the barn fire blurred into a relentless rhythm of work and vigilance. Mara and Gideon rose before dawn each morning and worked until darkness made it impossible to continue. They repaired fence, moved cattle, documented every instance of trespass and harassment in Peterson's legal forms. The stack of completed documentation grew thicker with each passing week. True to Mara's prediction, Boone's men rode by regularly to observe them. And each time they found Mara and Gideon working, not defeated, not broken, but continuing with grim determination. Mara made sure to be visible during these surveillance rides, often carrying the Winchester openly, making it clear she was armed and prepared. The psychological effect was exactly what she'd hoped for. The men stopped smirking, stopped making threats, just watched in silence and rode away, clearly reporting back to Boone that his intimidation tactics weren't having the desired effect. 6 weeks after the barn fire, Mara was working in the garden when she heard horses approaching at speed. Multiple riders, coming fast. She grabbed the rifle from where she'd propped it against the fence and moved toward the house, her heart racing. But it wasn't Boone's men. It was Gideon, returning from checking the northern pasture, and with him rode 2 other men Mara didn't recognize. They dismounted near the house, and Gideon's expression was carefully neutral, which usually meant he was barely containing strong emotion. "Mara," he called, "these men want to talk to us." She approached cautiously, the rifle still in her hands, studying the strangers. They were rough-looking men, weathered by years of outdoor work, wearing the practical clothes of ranch hands. One was the scarred man who'd threatened her weeks ago. The other was younger, nervous, his eyes darting between Mara and Gideon. "Mrs. Vale," Scarface said, and there was no mockery in his voice now. "I'm Horace Webb. This is Danny Sutton. We work for Silas Boone. Or we did until this morning." Mara's grip tightened on the rifle. "What do you want?" "To tell you what we know about the barn fire, about Boone's plans, about all of it." Webb's jaw clenched. "We're done being part of this." "Why?" Mara asked bluntly. "Why now?" Webb and Sutton exchanged glances. Finally, the younger man spoke. "Boone's planning something bigger, something that's going to get someone killed. We signed up to work cattle, not to be part of murder. When we told him we weren't comfortable with the new plan, he threatened us, said we knew too much to walk away clean." Sutton's voice shook slightly. "That's when we realized we needed insurance. We need someone who can protect us from Boone if we testify against him. Gideon leaned against the porch railing, his arms crossed. What's he planning? A stampede, Webb said grimly. He's going to spook your herd during the night, drive them toward the house. In the chaos and panic, accidents happen. Maybe the house catches fire. Maybe someone gets trampled. Either way, you're ruined or dead. And Boone walks away clean with his hands looking spotless. Mara felt ice slide down her spine. When? Week before the cattle sale. He wants to hit you when you're most vulnerable, when you've got everything riding on that sale going well. That was less than 3 weeks away. Gideon's expression had gone dangerously cold. You have proof of this? We have our testimony. We were in the meeting when Boone laid it out. Danny here took notes. He's good with letters, keeps records of everything. Sutton pulled a small notebook from his pocket. It's all in here. Dates, plans, conversations, everything Boone's done for the past year to squeeze you out. Mara and Gideon exchanged looks. This was exactly what Peterson had said they needed. Witnesses willing to testify, documentation that could be verified, evidence that told a story no reasonable person could ignore. Why should we trust you? Mara asked. You threatened me. You burned our barn. Webb had the grace to look ashamed. The barn wasn't us. That was Foster and his crew, the men Boone brings in for the dirty work he doesn't want traced back to his regular hands. But you're right not to trust us. We've done things we're not proud of. That's why we brought this. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. $700, our wages from the past year working for Boone. We figure it doesn't begin to cover what you've lost, but it's something. Payment for our testimony, if you'll have it. Gideon stared at the pouch, then at the two men. You're willing to testify in court? To put your names on legal documents? To face Boone in front of a judge? If you'll protect us, Sutton said. If you'll make sure Boone can't have us killed or run out of the territory before the trial. We need sanctuary, Mr. Vale. And we need to know that telling the truth won't get us buried in unmarked graves. Mara made a decision. Come inside. We'll hear everything you have to say. Then we'll decide what happens next. They spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table while Webb and Sutton laid out everything they knew. The systematic harassment campaign, the legal maneuvering, the bribes paid to certain town officials. The barn fire, which had indeed been set by men Boone brought in specifically for violent work. Men who'd disappeared back to wherever they'd come from as soon as the job was done. Mara took notes furiously, cross-referencing with the documentation she and Gideon had already compiled. The picture that emerged was damning. Boone had orchestrated a comprehensive campaign to destroy Gideon Vale, using every tool at his disposal, legal, illegal, and violently criminal. But now they had witnesses, they had documentation, they had evidence. When Webb and Sutton had finished talking, Gideon sat back in his chair thinking hard. If we go to the sheriff with this, he'll warn Boone. We need to go straight to the circuit judge. But the judge won't be back in the territory for another 2 weeks. That's cutting it close to the bank payment deadline, Mara said. I know, but it's our best shot. Gideon turned to Webb and Sutton. You can stay in the bunkhouse, or what's left of it. We'll feed you and keep you safe. But if you're lying to us, if this is some kind of trap Boone set up, it's not, Webb interrupted. I swear on my mother's grave. We're done with Boone. We just want to walk away from this with our lives and our consciences clear. They shook on it, and Mara showed the two men where they could bed down in the small storage shed that had survived the barn fire. It wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter. When she returned to the house, she found Gideon pacing the kitchen floor, his mind clearly racing. This changes everything, he said. If we can get this in front of a judge before the bank payment is due, we might be able to get an injunction against Boone. Force him to back off long enough for us to make the payment without worrying about sabotage. That's assuming the judge believes us. With Sutton's notebook and 2 witnesses willing to testify, he'll believe us. The question is whether he'll act fast enough. Mara pulled out their financial ledger, running the numbers again. Even with the $700 from Webb and Sutton, we're still short. The cattle sale has to go perfectly. We need top prices for every head we sell. Then we make sure they're in perfect condition. We spend the next 3 weeks doing nothing but preparing those cattle for sale. Make them so healthy and well-fed that buyers will compete for them. It was a solid plan, their only plan, really. The next morning, Mara rode to town alone, over Gideon's protests and went straight to Peterson's office. The lawyer's eyes widened when she walked in with Sutton's notebook and her own stack of documentation. "Mrs. Vale, this is unexpected. We have witnesses," Mara said without preamble. "Two of Boone's own men willing to testify against him, and we have written documentation of his entire campaign against us." She spent an hour walking Peterson through everything. The lawyer listened in growing amazement, occasionally asking questions, making notes of his own. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "If even half of this holds up in court, Boone is finished. But you're right about needing to get this in front of Judge Harrison as soon as he returns. In the meantime, I'll prepare the legal filing. Criminal charges for arson and conspiracy, civil suit for damages. We'll hit Boone with everything at once, make it impossible for him to wiggle out. How long do we have to wait for the judge?" 13 days. He'll be here on August 28th for the monthly circuit court session. 13 days. The cattle sale was September 5th. The bank payment was due September 15th. The timing was going to be brutally tight. Mara rode back to the ranch with her mind churning through contingencies and possibilities. When she arrived, she found Gideon working with Webb and Sutton to move the cattle to the richest pasture, the one they'd been saving for exactly this purpose. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked with focused intensity. The cattle were moved daily to ensure they had access to the best grass and water. Their coats were brushed until they gleamed. Any animal showing signs of illness was immediately isolated and treated. Gideon taught Mara the fine points of cattle evaluation, what buyers looked for, how to present animals to best advantage, the subtle art of negotiation. Meanwhile, Mara continued documenting everything. Every morning she walked the fence line, noting any new trespass. Every evening she updated the legal forms, building a comprehensive record. Webb and Sutton provided additional details, filling in gaps in the timeline, corroborating incidents Mara and Gideon had experienced but couldn't prove. The file grew to over 100 pages of meticulous documentation. On August 27th, the night before the judge was due to arrive, Mara lay awake in her bed listening to the sounds of the ranch. She'd grown accustomed to this place over the past 2 months, the creaking of the house settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind moving through the grass. It had become home in a way she hadn't expected. Tomorrow, everything would come to a head. Either the judge would grant them relief, or Boone would find a way to block their legal action. Either they'd get justice, or they'd lose everything. She must have eventually fallen asleep, because she woke to Gideon knocking gently on her door. "Mara, it's time. We need to be in town when the judge arrives." They dressed quickly and rode to town in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying the complete documentation file and accompanied by Webb and Sutton. Peterson met them at the courthouse steps, looking nervous but determined. "The judge arrived late last night," he said. "I've already filed notice that we have an urgent matter requiring immediate attention. He's agreed to hear us first thing this morning." The courthouse was a simple wood frame building that served multiple purposes: courtroom, town hall, occasional church. They entered to find Judge Harrison already seated at the bench, a severe-looking man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. And sitting at a table on the opposite side of the room was Silas Boone, flanked by 2 expensive lawyers from the territorial capital. Boone's expression when he saw Mara, Gideon, Webb, and Sutton was priceless, shock and rage warring across his face before he managed to control himself. "Your Honor," Peterson began, "we're here to present evidence of a systematic criminal campaign by Silas Boone to force my client, Gideon Vale, off his legally owned property through harassment, intimidation, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder." One of Boone's lawyers shot to his feet. "Your Honor, these are outrageous allegations without foundation. My client is a respected member of this community." "Which is why I'm going to hear the evidence before making any determinations," Judge Harrison interrupted sharply. "Mr. Peterson, you may proceed." What followed was 3 hours of detailed testimony. Peterson walked the judge through the documentation, starting with the first incidents of cattle trespass and escalating through the legal harassment, the intimidation of ranch hands, the dam construction, and finally, the barn fire. Webb and Sutton testified about their direct knowledge of Boone's plans, producing Sutton's notebook with its damning details. Boone's lawyers objected repeatedly, but Judge Harrison silenced them each time, his expression growing darker as the evidence mounted. Finally, Peterson presented the most recent piece of evidence, the planned stampede that Webb and Sutton had revealed. Your Honor, Peterson concluded, Mr. Boone has conducted a campaign of terror designed to force Mr. Vale into financial ruin so that Boone can acquire the property at auction for a fraction of its value. This is not a business dispute. This is criminal conspiracy, and my client requests immediate injunctive relief to prevent further harassment while criminal charges are pursued. Boone's lead lawyer stood, his face red with indignation. Your Honor, you're hearing the testimony of two disgruntled former employees with obvious axes to grind against my client. There's no independent verification of any of these wild claims. Actually, Judge Harrison interrupted, there's quite a bit of independent verification. The documentation Mrs. Vale has presented is remarkably thorough. Dates, times, witness statements, property damage assessments, all cross-referenced and consistent. He fixed Boone with a hard stare. Mr. Boone, do you have anything to say in your defense? Boone stood slowly, and Mara saw calculation in his eyes. He was trying to decide whether to bluster through or negotiate. Your Honor, there may have been some overzealousness by my employees in protecting my legitimate property interests. If any laws were broken, it was without my knowledge or consent. I'm prepared to offer Mr. Vale fair compensation for any damages he may have suffered. You're prepared to buy his silence, you mean? Judge Harrison said coldly. I've been doing this job for 23 years, Mr. Boone. I know a calculated campaign of harassment when I see one, and I particularly don't appreciate arson being committed in my jurisdiction. He turned to his clerk. I'm issuing an immediate restraining order. Mr. Boone, you and your employees are forbidden from trespassing on Mr. Vale's property, from interfering with his livestock or business operations, and from any contact whatsoever with Mr. or Mrs. Vale, except through legal representatives. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. Boone's face went purple with rage. You can't. I can, and I am. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for criminal investigation. If the evidence supports it, and frankly, it appears quite compelling, you'll be facing charges of arson, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked against the bench. This court is adjourned. Mr. Boone, I strongly suggest you hire better lawyers than these two. You're going to need them. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Boone was shouting, his lawyers were trying to calm him, townspeople who'd crowded in to watch were whispering excitedly. Mara felt Gideon's hand find hers under the table, squeezing tight. They'd won. They'd actually won. Peterson was grinning like a madman. That went better than I dared hope. With the restraining order in place, Boone can't interfere with your cattle sale. And if the prosecutor brings charges, which he will, the evidence is too strong, Boone's going to be too busy defending himself to worry about your land. Outside the courthouse, Webb and Sutton shook Gideon's hand. We'll be heading out of the territory, Webb said. Make a fresh start somewhere Boone's reach doesn't extend, but we'll come back if the prosecutor needs our testimony. Thank you, Gideon said simply. You did the right thing. Finally, Webb replied. Better late than never. They watched the two men ride away, then turned to find half the town staring at them from various doorways and windows. The story would be all over the territory by nightfall, how Gideon Vale and his sharp-tongued wife had taken on Silas Boone and won. Mrs. Pemberton was standing outside the general store, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and grudging respect. Mara caught her eye and smiled sweetly. Good morning, Mrs. Pemberton. Lovely day, isn't it? The older woman just shook her head and went back inside without a word. Gideon laughed, a genuine, relieved sound that Mara hadn't heard from him in weeks. You're going to be insufferable now, aren't you? Absolutely, I've earned it. They rode back to the ranch in the golden afternoon light, both giddy with relief and exhaustion. When they crested the ridge and looked down into the valley, the burned barn site was still visible, but now it felt less like a scar and more like a battle wound they'd survived. The cattle sale was a week later, and with Boone's interference removed, it went exactly as they'd hoped. The cattle were in prime condition, and buyers competed aggressively for the healthy, well-maintained herd. Gideon negotiated hard, and when the final tallies were counted, they'd brought in $1,200, $400 more than they'd projected. Combined with the $700 from Webb and Sutton and their existing savings, They had enough to make the bank payment with $300 to spare. On September 14th, the day before the payment was due, Mara and Gideon walked into the bank together. The banker's expression when they presented the full payment amount in cash was deeply satisfying. "The Vale Ranch is current on all obligations," Gideon said firmly, "and we'll be expecting a receipt confirming that." The banker produced the receipt with obvious reluctance. They walked out of that bank as free and clear landowners, the threat of foreclosure finally lifted. That evening, they stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. The dogs lay at their feet, content. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The house stood solid and welcoming behind them. "We did it," Mara said softly. "We actually did it." "You did it," Gideon corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you. The strategy, the documentation, standing up to Boone, all of it was you. It was us. Partners, remember?" Gideon turned to face her fully, and there was something in his expression that made Mara's breath catch. "I need to tell you something." "All right. When I asked you to stay that first night, when I offered you partnership, I meant it exactly as I said it. A practical arrangement between two people who needed what the other could provide." He reached for her hand. "But somewhere along the way, I don't know exactly when, it became more than that. You became more than that. And I need you to know that He paused, searching for words. "I love you, Mara. Not as a partner, not as a convenient arrangement, as my wife. As the person I want to spend the rest of my life building this ranch with." Mara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears this time. Tears of relief and joy and the overwhelming realization that she felt exactly the same way. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have since you stood up to Boone that first time he came here, since you treated me like an equal instead of property, since you listened to my ideas like they mattered. They did matter. You matter." He kissed her then, soft and careful, and Mara kissed him back with everything she had, all the fear and hope and determination of the past 2 months pouring into that moment. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "So what happens now?" Mara asked. "Now we rebuild the barn, plant winter wheat, prepare for next year's calving season. Live our lives without constantly looking over our shoulders for the next threat." Sounds boring. Sounds perfect. They stood together as darkness fell, watching their land settle into night. Somewhere out there, Silas Boone was probably raging about his defeat, hiring lawyers to fight the criminal charges, trying to salvage his reputation. But that was his problem now, not theirs. Mara and Gideon had won. They'd saved their ranch, built something real together, and proven that two people who refused to quit could overcome almost anything. 3 months later, in December, with snow falling gently outside and a fire crackling in the rebuilt fireplace, Mara sat at the kitchen table working on the ranch accounts. The ledger showed a small but real profit for the quarter. The fence line was completely repaired. The new barn was half finished, built stronger and better than the one that had burned. Gideon came in from checking the cattle, stamping snow from his boots, his cheeks red from the cold. "How's it looking?" he asked, gesturing to the ledger. "Good. Better than good, actually. If next year's cattle sale goes as well as this year's, we'll be able to start expanding, maybe hire a hand or two." "I was thinking about that." Gideon poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. "What would you think about breeding horses as well as cattle? We've got the pasture for it, and there's good money in quality stock." Mara considered it, running numbers in her head. "We'd need to invest in breeding stock, build proper stables. But yes, I think it could work. We'd be diversifying our income, reducing risk. See, this is why I married you, that practical mind. You married me because I was too stubborn to quit when you were ready to give up. That too." They smiled at each other across the table, comfortable in the life they'd built together. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the Wyoming plains in a blanket of white. Inside, the house was warm and solid, and full of the quiet contentment that came from work honestly done and challenges fairly met. Mara had come to this ranch 2 months ago as a woman everyone had overlooked, a widow with nothing but a bag of belongings and a rapidly diminishing hope for the future. She'd been invisible, dismissed, considered too old and too opinionated to be worth anyone's attention. But Gideon had seen her, really seen her, not as someone to be rescued or reformed, but as someone with value exactly as she was. And together, they'd built something that couldn't be taken away or destroyed. Not by fire, not by intimidation, not by the Silas Boones of the world who thought money and power were enough to crush anyone in their path. They'd built a partnership, a home, a life worth living. And sitting there in that warm kitchen with snow falling outside and the man she loved across from her, Mara realized something profound. She had finally found the place she belonged. Not because someone had chosen her from a platform or offered her charity or taken pity on her circumstances, but because she had chosen it herself. Because she had fought for it with everything she had. Because she had refused to accept being overlooked ever again. 6 months after the court case, word came that Silas Boone had been convicted of arson and conspiracy. He'd been sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison and ordered to pay substantial damages to Gideon and several other ranchers he'd targeted over the years. His vast ranch was being sold to cover the judgments, his empire crumbling under the weight of his own crimes. Justice, it turned out, sometimes did prevail, but by the time that news arrived, Mara and Gideon were too busy with their own lives to pay it much attention. There were horses to train, cattle to tend, a barn to finish building. There was a garden to plant come spring, and plans to discuss for expanding their operation. There was a life to live, the life they'd fought for and earned and built together from nothing but determination and mutual respect. And on a warm evening in late spring, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Gideon took Mara's hand and said something that made her heart swell with pride and satisfaction. "You know what the ranchers in town are calling you?" "What?" "The woman who broke Silas Boone. They say you're the toughest negotiator in the territory, that you've got a mind like a steel trap and a will that can't be bent." He grinned. "Mrs. Pemberton told someone you're proof that the Lord works in mysterious ways, taking a woman no one wanted and turning her into the most formidable force in Wyoming." Mara laughed, loud and genuine. "Mrs. Pemberton said that?" "She did. I think it was meant as a compliment, mostly." "I'll take it." Mara squeezed his hand, looking out over the land they'd saved together. "Though I prefer to think I was always formidable. People just weren't paying attention." "I was paying attention." "Yes, you were. That's why this worked." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The ranch stretched out before them, theirs completely now, free and clear, a testament to what two people could accomplish when they refused to give up on each other or themselves. Mara had left that bride gathering thinking her life was over, that she'd failed at being the kind of woman the world wanted her to be. But she'd been wrong. She hadn't failed. She'd simply been waiting for the right partnership, the right challenge, the right moment to prove what she'd always known deep in her bones, that she was worth so much more than anyone had ever given her credit for. And now, sitting on this porch with her husband beside her and her ranch thriving around her, Mara finally understood the truth. She hadn't been chosen that day. She'd been overlooked, dismissed, rejected by men who couldn't see her value. But in the end, that hadn't mattered at all, because she had chosen herself. She had chosen this life, this fight, this future. And that choice, made freely, claimed boldly, defended fiercely, had made all the difference.